It seems like another rainy day. Hello, my dear listener. It seems you've arrived just in time. Sit down and listen to the whisper of Jacob Miller before his end. Jacob Miller had always been a calm young man, grounded and with a simple life. Born in a small town in the state of Oregon, he never imagined that his life could change so drastically. But when things at home became unsustainable by the end of last fall, he knew something had to be done. The house where he lived with his grandmother, Eleanor, was no longer big enough for both of them. The small space had become cramped and suffocating, and the financial challenges only worsened every day. Now, at 22 years old, Jacob felt he needed more independence, more space for himself. That's when his longtime friend, Tyler Harris, and his mother, Monica, offered him a temporary solution. The Harris family had always been like a second home to Jacob, and the invitation to live with them was a blessing. The idea of living with people he trusted deeply seemed like the best way out, but at the same time, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't quite understand. The Harris house was large, located in a more remote area of town, but with enough space for Jacob to feel comfortable. He moved in with the promise that he would soon find something more permanent. Over time, things settled into a routine. Jacob, always careful not to intrude on the lives of his new family, made sure to keep his things in a small, discreet corner, neatly organized. However, something inside him was restless. The feeling that something significant was about to happen never left him. It was during this period that Jacob began to notice a subtle change in his life. He met Lily, a friend he had made in college, with whom he shared many interests. From the beginning, the chemistry between them was undeniable. They would talk for hours about everything, from horror movies to music, and of course, the problems of everyday life. Jacob enjoyed her company in a way that he could no longer hide, but he always feared that his feelings might not be reciprocated. However, when she revealed that she felt the same, their story took a completely different turn. After a few months of conversations and meetings, their relationship became more serious. It was something new, something vibrant, and Jacob knew he was ready to take the next step. But there was one detail he couldn't ignore. Lily lived more than 300 kilometers away, which complicated things a bit. She had mentioned several times that she wanted to visit him, but she was hesitant, especially because she wasn't sure if her parents would approve of the relationship. To avoid problems, she decided to tell them she was only visiting a friend. Jacob, though understanding her concern, couldn't shake the discomfort he felt about the idea of having his girlfriend stay at the Harris house. He knew it was time to take a more significant step in his life. That's when the idea of living alone came up. Jacob began looking for a place to call his own, a space where he could finally live without worries or explanations to anyone. He found the perfect studio, small but comfortable, located in the basement of an old building. The rent was reasonable, utilities were included, and most importantly, the space seemed ideal for him. After his application was approved, he didn't waste any time moving in, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He knew he was about to take an important step, but he also felt that something was about to change in a way he couldn't control. Jacob moved into his new apartment on the first day of June, excited by the idea of finally having a place of his own. The smell of the new apartment, the emptiness of those walls without history, it all felt surreal. Despite the sense of freedom, there was a twinge of loneliness. But he soon adjusted. He was right there, in his own space, ready to begin planning Lily's visit. They had agreed that she would come between June 17th and 21st. Everything seemed to be falling into place. He was starting to build his life again. But that night, when the clock struck 2 in the morning and Jacob was preparing to sleep, the unexpected happened. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and a storm was approaching rapidly. He lay in bed, waiting for sleep, but anxiety prevented him. With every thunderclap outside, his heart raced. Jacob enjoyed storms. They always made him feel comfortable in a strange way. But that night, something was different. As he settled back into bed, facing the window, he heard a faint noise coming from outside. A soft crack. He thought it was the wind, but it soon grew stronger. Soft knocks, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Jacob turned to look out the window. The darkness outside seemed thicker, more oppressive. The knocks continued. He tried to ignore them. Maybe it was just the storm. Maybe it was just the wind hitting something. But as the sound persisted, he couldn't help but wonder, what or who was out there? The doubt consumed him, and he grabbed his phone to send a message to Lily. "I know it sounds strange, but I'm starting to hear some noises outside the window. Must be from the storm, right? But it's kind of freaking me out." She quickly replied, trying to reassure him. But still, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he turned back to the window, the sound intensified, knocking harder, as if someone were trying to force the window open. It was then that Jacob realized that perhaps the storm was the least of the things he would have to face that night. Jacob didn't know what to think. The knocks were getting louder, faster. It was impossible to ignore them now. They weren't caused by the wind, he knew that. The wind was doing its job on the roof and the trees outside, but the knocks, these seemed to have an intention. He got out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Each thunderclap that erupted in the sky made the sound of the knocks seem even stranger, as if the storm itself was trying to infiltrate his apartment. With trembling hands, he pulled back the curtain and looked through the small window. In the dark of the night, he could barely see anything beyond the shadows, but the knocks continued. What the hell is going on? He thought, trying to calm his breathing. It was just a basement window, a poorly lit emergency exit that opened into a small garden at the back of the building. But at that moment, it felt like the most important thing in the world. He looked closer, trying to see any movement. No branches, no animals, just darkness. The knocks grew louder. Suddenly, a louder crack and a thud against the window. Jacob felt his body tremble. Something was out there. He didn't know what, but he felt like he shouldn't be near the window. Yet, something pushed him toward it, a morbid curiosity he couldn't control. He looked again, but this time the feeling was different. It was as if something was watching him, waiting. The wind howled outside, but he felt a deep chill, a presence in the air, something that didn't fit with the rest of the storm. He stepped back from the window and quickly grabbed his phone, sending a message to Lily. "I'm starting to get paranoid, but there's something outside the window trying to open it. I know it must just be the storm, but I can't stop hearing it. It's getting weird." She responded almost immediately, her reassuring voice coming through her typed words. "You must be imagining things, Jake. If it was anything, it wouldn't be sitting there knocking for so long. Maybe a branch. Just breathe." But Jacob couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. Something in the air made him feel a growing pressure on his shoulders. He turned off his phone and tried to lie down again, but the sound continued. He could no longer ignore it. With every knock, his heart raced faster, his body tensed. He got up again, moving toward the window with the intention of checking. But when he looked through the curtain, he saw nothing but blackness. Only this time, he felt an even stronger presence. He decided he was going to investigate once and for all. With hesitant steps, he moved away from the window and approached the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. Everything was so quiet. Even the sound of the storm seemed more distant now, muffled by the fear that enveloped him. Jacob crept through the dark hallway of the apartment and made his way to the small frosted glass window. He hesitated for a second, wondering if he should pull back the curtains. But he needed to know what was happening. With his hands still trembling, Jacob yanked the curtains back with a sudden motion. The window was covered in a thick layer of rain, but now, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could clearly see the silhouette of something in front of the window. Whatever it wasn't knocking anymore, but it remained there, motionless. Jacob blinked, confused. He could have sworn no one was there just moments before. It was impossible. Suddenly, The knock started again, stronger, faster. Jacob pulled away from the window with a jolt. Something wasn't right. He began to wonder if there was any rational explanation for what was happening, but he couldn't find one. He felt the urge to pick up the phone and call someone, but he hesitated. Who would believe him? His mind was falling apart. He couldn't distinguish what was real from what was hallucination. Every sound seemed to echo in his head in an unbearable way. Fear consumed him with every passing second. The knocks grew more intense. Then suddenly, he felt a presence behind him, a chill that ran down his spine. Jacob spun around, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. The apartment was empty, silent. All he could hear was the sound of the knocks on the window. The sensation of being watched became unbearable. He thought about calling his mother, but he didn't want to seem dramatic, so he picked up his phone again and sent a message to his uncle, who was a police officer and lived in the neighboring town. "Hey, Uncle Lucas, I'm starting to get scared. Something strange is happening here. Someone's trying to get in through the window. Can you come over?" The response was almost immediate. "I'm on my way, Jake. Stay calm." But time seemed to stop as he waited. Each second felt like an eternity. The sound of the knocks was getting more frantic, and Jacob couldn't take it anymore. He needed to know what was out there. Even though he knew he was being irrational, he moved toward the window one last time. When he looked outside, what he saw froze him. There wasn't just a presence anymore. There was something, a skeletal figure, hooded, with white, empty eyes, staring directly into his. Jacob was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. But before he could scream or move, the figure disappeared into the darkness of the night. It was at that exact moment that he heard the sound of the apartment door opening. His Uncle Lucas had arrived. But what would he bring with him? The answer to what was happening, or something even more terrifying. When the apartment door opened, Jacob could barely react. The sound of the lock was muffled by the howling wind outside and by his own heart, which seemed to want to leap out of his chest. He turned quickly, expecting to see his Uncle Lucas enter, but what he found was only the emptiness of the dark hallway. The door was open, and the knocking on the window continued relentlessly, louder, more frantic. But for a moment, the silence in the rest of the apartment seemed almost unbearable. Jacob stood there, frozen, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for his uncle to arrive. But minutes passed, and nothing happened. Fear began to turn into confusion, and he felt a growing pressure in his head, as though something were pressing on his temples, preventing him from thinking clearly. He whispered faintly, calling for his uncle, but his voice seemed weak, almost swallowed by the storm. Then he heard a voice. It wasn't his mother's, nor his uncle's, nor Lily's. It was a faint voice, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere nearby. Jacob cautiously approached the door, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him. "Lucas?" he called in a low, tense tone, not knowing if he was truly calling someone or just trying to hold on to his sanity. But instead of an answer, he heard a sound coming from the hallway. Slow, dragging footsteps, making a peculiar noise, as if something heavy were being moved with difficulty. Jacob swallowed hard, his throat tight with anxiety. He didn't want to go down there, didn't want to see what was making that sound. But with an instinctive impulse, he pulled away from the door and headed toward the hallway, his breath growing more ragged with each step. He walked cautiously, each step more tense than the last, until he reached the entrance of the hallway. There, he paused for a moment, staring into the dark space where the storm's light barely penetrated. The wind outside made the shadows dance on the walls, as if the very environment were alive, moving and breathing. Jacob tried to control his breath, but he felt as though something was watching him, as though a presence was following his every step. Then he saw something, a dark figure, a shadow, moving at the end of the hallway. What seemed to be a hooded body, its figure distorted, moved slowly, its shoulders hunched and head bowed. as if searching for something or someone. Jacob froze, the blood running cold in his veins. He didn't know if it was real or if his mind was creating an illusion due to the fear, but the terror he felt was so palpable that he couldn't deny it. "Who are you?" Jacob finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse and trembling. The shadow didn't answer, but its dragging footsteps continued, as if it were drawing closer and closer. Jacob stepped back, trying to retreat, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Each movement seemed to cost him an eternity, as if reality were warping around him. The shadow drew nearer, and Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine. He wanted to scream, to run outside, but he was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare at the ghostly figure approaching. Finally, just as he was about to turn and flee, the shadow lifted its head, revealing a face, or rather, a lack of one. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, lifeless holes, as if someone had ripped away all the essence of that being. What remained was a pale, cadaverous face, its skin stretched tight over the bones, and a smile that didn't seem human, but rather a grotesque distortion of what a living being could display. Jacob couldn't scream. He tried, but his throat was tight, and he felt as though the air was being sucked from his body. The shadow didn't move for a moment, but the tension in the air grew even more oppressive. Then, as though it had made a decision, it took a step forward. The sound of its foot dragging on the floor echoed in the empty apartment. It was at that moment that Jacob finally managed to move, but impulsively. He ran back toward the apartment, desperate, not daring to look back. Every step he took seemed to be accompanied by the sound of dragging feet behind him. He ran to the couch, grabbed his phone with trembling hands, and with difficulty typed a message to his uncle. "Lucas, something is happening. Something I can't explain. Please come soon." He didn't know if his uncle would make it in time, or if something worse was about to happen. But something inside Jacob knew he wasn't alone in that apartment. He could feel the eyes of that thing on him, even without looking back. The sensation of being watched followed him, growing stronger by the second. Then a sound came from the hallway. It wasn't dragging footsteps anymore, but a low, muffled laugh, as if someone were enjoying his fear. Jacob turned toward the door, his eyes wide with terror. He needed to get out of there, but the feeling that he no longer had control over the situation was overwhelming. The exit door was closed, but with every step he took toward it, the sound of the laughter seemed to grow louder, closer, as if that thing was right behind him. What was behind the door? He didn't want to find out, but when he looked around, he noticed something even more terrifying. The shadow he had seen earlier was now on the wall to his right, taller, closer. He felt his body freeze again as the laughter transformed into distorted words, as though someone was trying to communicate with him in a way he couldn't understand. The words became clearer, like a grotesque echo in his mind. "You won't get out." Jacob felt a wave of despair flood his soul. Something was starting to stir inside him, something he couldn't control. He had to get out. He had to get out immediately. But what was happening in that apartment felt like more than just a nightmare. It was real, and it was only just beginning. Jacob turned, feeling the adrenaline take over his body. The environment around him seemed to spin, as if reality itself were being distorted. He could no longer deny it. Something was happening here, something beyond his understanding. He quickly glanced at the exit door, but the laughter continued to echo through the apartment, now louder, more distorted. The feeling that something was approaching in a predatory manner made him tremble to his bones. With his mind in panic, Jacob no longer knew what to do. He was trapped, as if the very house were closing in around him. The laughter he had heard moments ago, now transformed into words, infiltrated his thoughts. "You won't get out." That voice seemed to scratch at his mind, making each thought more distant, more confused. He stepped away from the door and looked into the dark hallway, the only escape route. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner was swallowed by darkness. Fear clouded his thinking, but instinctively, he knew he couldn't stay there. That apartment was no longer safe. The presence he felt, that dense and oppressive energy, was growing stronger by the second. Jacob moved away from the door, searching for some way to protect himself. That's when he heard something that made him stop for a moment. The sound of fast, heavy footsteps coming from the hallway. It wasn't the slow footsteps he had heard before, but something more aggressive, something approaching with supernatural speed. The sound of boots hitting the floor was muffled by the wind, but it still seemed unmistakable. Jacob turned, his eyes widening as he realized the figure was closer than he had imagined. In the darkness, the silhouette of a tall man began to take shape. His body, though human, seemed distorted, as if immersed in a thick fog. The most disturbing thing was the absence of a face. There were no eyes, no mouth, no other human features, just a generic form of head and torso, shrouded in a cloak that seemed made of shadows, without any other definition. It was as if the figure was there, yet at the same time, it wasn't. Like a flaw in reality itself, Jacob felt his blood freeze. He tried to step back, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The fear was so intense that it made him feel physically paralyzed. The dark man didn't move, but his eyes, or what Jacob believed were his eyes, seemed to be fixed on him. Jacob knew that, on some level, the thing was watching him, waiting for some kind of reaction. He didn't know what it wanted or what it would do, but somehow he felt that he needed to face it. "Who are you?" Jacob finally managed to whisper, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. But the figure didn't respond. It just remained still, motionless, the silhouette floating in the darkness as though it were part of the air itself. The silence was deafening. Jacob felt the pressure building. Every breath seemed harder to take. The knocking on the window had stopped, but the tension in the atmosphere was becoming unbearable. It was as if the very space around him was compressing, as if he were being swallowed by something invisible and malevolent. He needed to get out of there, but his legs wouldn't obey. Suddenly, the dark man took a step forward. Jacob felt his presence invade the space, the dark energy approaching with terrifying speed. He tried to move, but his body seemed to be in slow motion, trapped in a nightmare. The figure was now only a few meters away, and Jacob could feel the cold emanating from it. It wasn't just a physical chill, but something deeper, as if his soul was being touched by something much older and more dangerous. The shadow raised one of its hands, which seemed to stretch toward Jacob. As the arm neared him, the air around him seemed to thicken, as though suffocating him. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. Only the sound of his ragged breathing echoed through the apartment. Then, when the touch of that thing finally reached him, something strangely cold spread through his body, as if his veins were freezing. He felt a pull, an invisible force that made him feel weaker and weaker. The sensation was so intense that he could barely keep himself standing. His hands began to tremble violently, and his vision blurred, as though everything around him were beginning to disintegrate. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The touch vanished, and silence took over the apartment once again. Jacob fell to his knees on the floor, gasping for breath and confused. He looked up, expecting to see the figure still there, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness that filled the hallway. He got up, his muscles still weak, but managed to crawl to the exit door. His heart was pounding in his chest, but something urged him to leave, to get out of that place. When he finally opened the door, a shock paralyzed him. On the other side, in the dark hallway, was a figure. Not the same shadow, but something equally terrifying. A tall, skeletal figure with pale skin standing at the door, its white, empty eyes fixed on him. The terror Jacob felt was instant. He no longer had the strength to fight. There was no escape. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for him. The door had closed behind him, and he was trapped, nowhere left to go. The distorted laughter, which had until now been a distant threat, was now right there, in his ears. Jacob turned to face the being, but fear stopped him from moving. He knew he couldn't escape. Whatever that being was, it was there for him. The light of the hallway lamp flickered briefly, then went out, plunging the apartment into complete darkness. Jacob didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. He was no longer alone. And what was in front of him was not human. He could only hope that his Uncle Lucas, if he was really coming, wouldn't arrive too late. Jacob no longer knew what to feel. The presence in front of him was palpable, as if the darkness itself had materialized in human form. The tall, skeletal figure stood at the door, its empty white eyes fixed on him, as if it were watching every breath, every movement, every thought. Fear paralyzed him, making his body tremble uncontrollably, but something inside him told him he had to react, that his survival depended on it. But the words wouldn't come. His mind was in turmoil, and his body felt as heavy as lead, unable to move. The being in front of him made no immediate movement. It just stood there, still, watching him with those lifeless eyes. Jacob tried to scream, but his throat felt closed, as if an invisible grip was suffocating him. It was as if the very air had become thicker, harder to breathe. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. The sound of its movement was like a whisper, a vibration that ran through the air, as if the reality around them was about to break. Jacob instinctively stepped back, feeling the heavy wooden door behind him. But he knew he couldn't escape. Not this time. Something inside him told him he had to face what was there. What had invaded his life in such a sudden and terrifying way? The shadow moved closer, its pale, elongated hands reaching out toward Jacob, as if preparing to touch him. The sensation of cold was immediate, almost electric. Jacob felt a deep shiver run down his spine. He tried to step back, but he was frozen. His legs were immobile, his mind deep in panic. He wanted to run, wanted to fight, but all he could do was stare at the creature in front of him, powerless. It was then that the figure finally spoke. The voice was not human. It was a low whisper, as if emanating from the depths of an abyss. "You can't escape," the voice said, dragging each word, as if it were a threat whispered directly into his soul. Jacob tried to resist, but panic took over him. He knew that this being wasn't made of flesh and bone. It wasn't something that could be fought or expelled. It was a presence, a manifestation of something much older, something that couldn't be explained. The figure's words sounded like an echo, reverberating in his mind, tearing apart any remnants of reason that remained. "You are ours now." The words echoed in his mind, and Jacob felt his body begin to give way, as if he were being pulled into the darkness. But then something inside him awakened, a survival instinct. He knew that if he didn't do something, he would be lost there, forever. With a titanic effort, Jacob took a step back, distancing himself from the figure. He felt the air grow thicker, colder, but something in his mind cleared. The exit was there, not behind him, but in front of him. The door. He couldn't hesitate any longer. The creature made no movement as Jacob began to retreat, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. He knew the entity was just waiting for him to make the slightest mistake, waiting for him to falter. The tension in the room was almost tangible. The air was heavy, and the pressure in his chest was nearly unbearable. Jacob, with sweaty hands and trembling feet, finally managed to move toward the door. Every step seemed harder than the last, as if the house itself was trying to hold him back, keeping him there under the control of that presence. But he couldn't give up. He had no choice. He reached the door, the cold doorknob beneath his fingers, and twisted it with all his strength. When the door opened, Jacob felt a breath of relief. But before he could take the first step out, he heard a noise behind him, a loud sound, the sound of a blade being drawn from a sheath. He turned quickly, his heart racing. The figure was there, closer than before, and now it held a knife. The gleam of the blade reflected the dim light from the hallway lamp, casting a macabre reflection on the walls around him. "You won't escape," the voice said again, louder this time, and Jacob felt a chill of terror rise up his spine. But before the creature could take another step, the light bulb flickered, and the apartment was filled with a sharp, deafening scream. Jacob covered his ears, trying to shield himself from the noise, but the scream didn't stop. It was as if something, or someone, was fighting against the figure that was hunting him. He felt the pressure in the environment grow even stronger, and the air became denser and warmer. And then, like a miracle, the light bulb exploded. Darkness instantly consumed the apartment. Jacob froze in place, not knowing what to do. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. But these weren't the creature's footsteps. They were someone else's. Suddenly, a familiar voice emerged from the darkness. "Jacob, where are you?" It was Lucas. Jacob's uncle had finally arrived, shouting his name urgently. With an effort of will, Jacob shouted back, his voice weak and trembling, "Lucas, help me! It's here!" He pointed to the empty space where the creature was, or where he thought it was, but the darkness was too thick for anyone to see. The sound of quick footsteps, followed by a flash of light from Lucas's flashlight, illuminated the scene, revealing the empty apartment. The figure had disappeared. There were no signs of its presence, only emptiness, darkness, and fear. Lucas ran to Jacob, still confused and trying to understand what was happening. "What was that? What's going on here?" he asked, his voice full of terror. Jacob didn't know how to explain. He was in shock, his words wouldn't come, but something inside him knew. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, waiting. It wasn't over. It was just the beginning, and the worst was yet to come. Jacob felt the ground beneath his feet starting to disintegrate. Lucas's flashlight cast grotesque shadows on the walls, but the darkness seemed to rise again with every passing second, as if it were a living entity, waiting to swallow everything. Fear still pulsed through his veins, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The presence was there, somehow, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Lucas, with the flashlight trembling in his hand, looked around, trying to understand what was happening. "Jacob, are you okay? What's going on here?" he asked, his voice heavy with confusion and concern. But Jacob couldn't respond. He wanted to, but the words were stuck in his throat, as if the house itself were preventing him from speaking. He glanced at the corridor, where the darkness still stretched, cold and impenetrable. He couldn't deny it. The entity was close, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Something inside him told him that the figure that had attacked him wasn't the only being inhabiting this place. There was more. Something much older, something more malevolent, was awakening. The sound of a distant scream echoed through the depths of the night, as if someone were being dragged into an abyss. Jacob turned quickly, his vision blurred with tension, but saw nothing. The scream seemed to have come from the far end of the corridor, as if it were a call, a summons to something he shouldn't understand. But the scream wasn't human. It was something deep, grotesque, almost animalistic. I don't know what happened, Lucas," Jacob finally managed to speak, his voice sounding weak and broken. "I saw something. Something I can't explain. It's not normal." Lucas, still not understanding, took a step toward him, trying to calm him. Calm down, calm down. You must have had a nightmare. Let's get out of here and..." But before he could finish, the lights began to flicker again, more intensely now. The sound of the wind howling outside grew louder, as if a storm were approaching, but there were no clouds in the sky. The lights started to go out one by one, leaving the apartment progressively darker. Jacob felt the fear grow in his chest. "Lucas, the thing... The thing that was here, it's coming back. We can't stay here. Lucas looked around, suspicious, but when he saw the genuine terror in Jacob's eyes, his face grew more serious. He glanced at the dark corridor and made a move to proceed. Let's get out of here then. We'll go to the car and get help. But at that moment, the sound of knocks on the window started again. This time, the knocks weren't isolated. They were fast, strong, as if a monstrous hand were trying to force the window open. The sound didn't come from outside, but from within the wall, as if the house itself were trying to grab their attention. The noise made Jacob's body tremble with terror, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. "Lucas, no!" Jacob screamed, pulling his uncle by the arm. "Don't open the door! Don't go near the window." Dot. Lucas looked at him with disbelief, but before he could say anything, the knocking grew louder. It was stronger, faster, more violent. The air became thick and heavy, and the walls seemed to groan under the pressure. The wind, which had seemed distant before, now seemed to swirl around them, invading the house with overwhelming force. Then, the lights finally went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. The silence that followed was crushing, but it didn't last long. The sound of knocking on the window grew louder, now mixed with a guttural scream that sounded like a lament, but also like a threat. Jacob felt terror seize his body. Lucas tried to turn on the flashlight, but it flickered once before dying completely. The only sound left was the wind, now howling like a hungry beast, and the knocking that echoed, distorted, through the walls of the house. Jacob grabbed Lucas's arm, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here now. Can't wait any longer." Dot. But when Lucas tried to move toward the door, the window exploded. There was no crack or explosion, just a silent rupture, as if the glass had been shattered by the force of something invisible. Small shards of glass fell to the floor, but the sense of danger didn't come from the shards. It came from the presence that now filled the place. Something was entering, something that shouldn't exist. Jacob and Lucas froze. There was nowhere left to run. The corridor was now filled with an expanding shadow, a darkness that seemed to grow, swallowing everything around them. The feeling of being surrounded intensified, and when they looked at the broken window, a figure appeared suddenly in the opening. It was the same silhouette Jacob had seen before, but now something had changed. The figure wasn't just observing anymore. It was moving, slowly advancing, as if feeding on the darkness around it. Its distorted body and long, pale hands stretched toward them. Its eyes were glowing, but there was no life in them, only emptiness and terror. Jacob and Lucas didn't know what to do. Every movement felt harder, as if the air itself were thickening. The figure took another step forward, and when the apartment door creaked open, Jacob knew they were no longer in control of the situation. They were at the mercy of that presence. Whatever it was there to take them, to consume them, and now there was no escape. "Lucas!" Jacob screamed, desperate. "We're not going to make it!" Dot. But before he could finish, a cold, pale hand emerged from the darkness, wrapping around them in a deathly grip. The air became ice cold, and for a brief moment, all Jacob could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing, mixed with the muffled sound of distorted laughter echoing in his mind. The house was alive, and what was hunting them wasn't a thing. It was a force, and no matter how hard they tried to fight, whatever it was far beyond their understanding. The darkness around Jacob and Lucas seemed to take on a life of its own. It was a physical sensation, as if the very space itself were trying to close in on them, to swallow them in an endless vortex. The cold was unbearable, and the pressure in Jacob's chest only increased with every passing second. He couldn't understand what was happening. His thoughts were jumbled, as if he were being pulled into a distant place, to something he wasn't supposed to see, wasn't supposed to understand. Lucas was there beside him, but unlike Jacob, his face was contained. The fear was there, clearly, but he was still trying to maintain his rationality. "Calm down, Jacob," he said, trying to grab his nephew's arm. "We need to get out of this house. I know it's tough, but we have to stay calm. This will pass." Jacob wanted to believe Lucas's words, but something inside him told him that none of this would pass. Whatever had invaded this place wasn't something simple, something that would disappear with the morning. No, what was here had deep roots, something ancient and merciless. It wasn't just a manifestation of terror, it was something that had existed long before they arrived. And now, he and Lucas were trapped in that web, with no chance of escape. The figure in front of them took another step closer, its presence stronger, more unyielding, and the sound of its hands scraping the wall grew louder. Jacob felt Lucas's hand tighten around his, but it was as if the creature's force had shattered the barrier of time and space. He didn't know if he was awake or dreaming, but he felt that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. What scared Jacob the most, however, weren't the creature's lifeless eyes or its distorted body, which seemed to ooze into the darkness. It was what he felt, an overwhelming and disturbing sensation that somehow that thing knew what he feared. He didn't know how, but he felt that the entity was reading his mind, using his worst nightmares against him. "Lucas." Jacob tried to speak, but his voice faltered as if something were choking him. He didn't know if he could keep talking, but he had to. "Lucas, did you see the door?" "Dot." Lucas quickly glanced back, but the door was shut. It was intact. But Jacob knew what he had seen. He had seen the doorknob gently shaking, as if something were trying to open it. And now, he felt that the door wasn't just a door, it was a thin line between this world and something far worse. "I know," Lucas said, trying to stay calm. "I saw it too, but now's not the time to think about the door. We need to get out before it's too late." Before he could continue, a sharp scream pierced the air, coming from the direction of the door. It sounded like something being violently torn away, the scream of a soul in agony. And the door, which had previously seemed stationary, now moved. The doorknob turned on its own, as if an invisible force were trying to open the way to the unknown. "No," Jacob shouted, almost out of control. "Don't open the door!" "Dot." But before he could stop him, the air around them seemed to thicken. The pressure increased, and Lucas was one step away from giving in, staring fixedly at the doorknob that kept turning with a sinister sound. The cold wind began to cut through the room, as if a gust had invaded the house, freezing everything. Time seemed to have stopped, but the door did not. It continued to open slowly, threateningly, with a force Jacob couldn't comprehend. When the door finally opened, the sight that greeted them made Jacob's stomach churn. There was no dark corridor, no simple darkness like before. Now, behind the door, there was a vortex, a deep, black opening that seemed to lead somewhere very, very far away. A draft from within the door carried the scent of mold and decay, as if that place existed outside of time. But the most terrifying thing was the sound emanating from inside, a mixture of whispers and distorted laughter, low and twisted, as if many voices were speaking at once, overlapping each other. Jacob felt his head spin, his legs weakening beneath him. "We need to get out of here, now!" But Lucas, in a burst of desperation, moved toward the door. We can't leave this behind. Whatever it is, we need to understand it. It's got something to do with all of this." Jacob tried to pull him back, but Lucas's gaze was fixed on the vortex. It was as if he were hypnotized, as if he were being drawn into the abyss. "Lucas, no!" Jacob screamed, desperate, but it was too late. Lucas stepped through the threshold of the door, and Jacob felt a wave of terror wash over his body. He tried to run after his uncle, but before he could take 2 steps, the door slammed shut with a bang, cutting off his path. Jacob was alone, in the middle of the dark corridor, with the feeling that the very place was pulsating around him. Something was approaching. The room grew icy, and Jacob felt the pressure in his chest grow even stronger. He knew he had to get out, but whatever was behind him seemed to be getting closer with every second. It wasn't just the creature he had seen earlier. No, now what was chasing him was something much larger, much more relentless. Jacob looked at the broken window and saw only darkness outside, as if the world itself were disappearing. He took a hesitant step toward the door, but before he could open it, a scream from Lucas came from behind it, a scream of pain and agony that froze his blood. "Jacob!" Lucas's voice called, but it was no longer the same Lucas. The voice was distorted, ragged, as if it were coming from somewhere else. "Help me! Don't leave me!" Terror took over Jacob, and he knew something terrible was happening to his uncle. The door wouldn't open, but he had to do something. Anything. Jacob looked down the corridor, his mind completely blank. But when he looked to the end of the path, he saw something strange. There was a staircase where there hadn't been one before, a staircase leading down into the darkness. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he couldn't stay there. Whatever was behind him or inside that door was about to reveal itself in all its monstrous form. And with no other choice, he started to descend. Jacob descended the steps slowly, trying to maintain his balance as the weight of terror pressed down on his body like a ton of bricks. Each step seemed to take him deeper into an abyss of darkness, as if he were crossing a thin line between reality and something he should never touch. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in the void, but as he moved forward, the silence became more oppressive, more suffocating. What the hell was happening? Where was Lucas? Jacob's mind couldn't process everything that had occurred that night. The house, which had once seemed like a simple structure, now felt like a living being, breathing, moving, manipulating everything around it. He knew he couldn't trust anything there. He couldn't even trust the ground he stood on. But Lucas's scream, the sound of his voice, was still fresh in his memory, and that drove him to keep going. The stairs seemed to descend further and further. Jacob could almost feel the pressure in his head, as if the walls were closing in around him. Something was down there, something that was calling to him, something that desired his presence. He felt as if he were being drawn in, as if an invisible force was pulling him, something he couldn't understand but already felt was a part of him. Then, down below, at the end of the stairs, a faint light appeared. It wasn't a natural light, but a suppressed, muffled glow, as if coming from a flame on the verge of being extinguished. Jacob's vision was blurry, his eyes tired and fearful, but still he moved closer, moving with the precision of someone who no longer had the strength to resist. Whatever it was calling him. He needed to know what was happening. He needed to understand. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a narrow corridor, much smaller than any part of the house he had known. The walls were damp and dirty, and the floor seemed to be made of packed earth, as though it had never been touched by anything human. The light illuminating the hallway came from an old gas lamp fixed to the wall. It swayed gently, as if in a weak breeze, but there was no wind. "What is this?" Jacob asked himself, but the answer never came. Only silence, and the sound of something distant. What he heard, however, wasn't just the wind. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices, one overlapping the other. A whisper that crawled along the walls, low and incomprehensible, but somehow directed at him. And as he walked, the whisper grew clearer. Jacob stopped. There was no escape now. He knew he was close to something far worse than anything he could imagine. The corridor in front of him seemed to stretch on forever, like an endless tunnel. But there was a door ahead, a weathered wooden door that exhaled a strange, putrid smell. He didn't know how he knew it, but he knew the answer to everything was behind that door. The presence in the house, the creature, Lucas's scream. It was all connected to that door. Jacob looked back, hesitant. He didn't know if he should turn back, if there was still time to escape from this cursed house. But then the sound of more voices, more whispers, grew louder, and the words became clearer. "Jacob, you have to enter." The voice was soft, almost seductive, but there was something sinister in it. The word enter was repeated several times, like an echo, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. He didn't know why, but he knew the voices were familiar. They called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Something inside him was lost, something was unraveling, and those voices seemed to be the key to everything. He took a deep breath, and without further hesitation, pushed the door. The sound of the creak was deafening, as if the very air was being compressed to allow the passage. The light inside the room was faint, but as he entered, it grew stronger, revealing an indescribable scene. What he saw was something his mind refused to understand, but somehow he knew, in some way, that he could never forget it. It was a circular room with stone walls. In the center of the room stood an altar made of a material that seemed ancient and worn. He didn't know what was on the altar, but something about the energy in the room made him not want to get closer. It was as if something was waiting there. He didn't know if it was a being or an entity, or perhaps just an emptiness. But the feeling of being watched consumed him completely. Around the altar, there were dark figures, silhouettes that didn't seem human but were somehow moving. The shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, but not in a normal way. They danced, as if they were alive, with their own life, moving in a rhythm that only they could understand. Jacob swallowed hard, fear growing inside him. He wanted to turn back, leave the room, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The door behind him slammed shut with a bang, and he knew he could no longer go back. It was too late. Then a figure appeared in front of him. It was a woman, but her presence was strange, distorted, as if she were part of the shadow hanging over that place. She looked at him with empty, lifeless eyes and spoke a single sentence, a sentence that made his blood boil. "You shouldn't have come." Jacob tried to speak, to ask for an explanation, but the words failed him. Something was stopping him from moving, from thinking clearly. He was trapped, not just physically, but spiritually. The woman raised one hand and the room seemed to vibrate with the gesture, as if reality itself were distorting around him. "Now that you're here," she continued, with a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once, "there's no way out. You are part of this. You always have been." Jacob felt his breath falter. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The room around him began to shake, and the dark figures slowly began to move closer. Each of their steps made the ground tremble. He wanted to wake up, but deep down, he knew this wasn't a nightmare. He was trapped there, forever. The air was heavy and unbearable, as if it were being compressed by an invisible force. Jacob could barely breathe. His mind spun, confused and terrified, as he tried to process what was happening around him. The dark figures, those distorted silhouettes, were drawing closer. He didn't know what they were, but something inside him told him they were there for something far worse than he could imagine. The woman with the empty eyes stood in front of him, motionless, like a living statue. She no longer spoke, but the feeling that she was watching him with a sinister interest was palpable. Jacob felt his body freeze. He didn't know what she wanted, but he knew he couldn't stay there much longer. Something was forming in the shadows, something that went beyond any rational explanation. "You can't leave," the woman finally said, her voice sharp like glass. "You'll never leave here again." Her words reverberated in his mind, making the ground beneath his feet feel like it was dissolving. He looked behind him, but the door through which he had entered was disappearing, swallowed by thick darkness. The corridor that had led him there was now completely gone, as if it had never existed. He was surrounded, trapped in a room that seemed to have no end. And the worst part was, he knew she was right. He hadn't come there by accident. He had always been part of this place, this curse, and now it was too late to turn back. Jacob tried to step back, but the dark figures, which had been moving along the walls, were now closing in on him more rapidly. They surrounded him, tightening the circle. He could hear their whispers, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. The voices sounded like a tangled web of words, but the tone of each one was filled with suffering, something ancient and lost. They were communicating with each other, sharing something Jacob couldn't comprehend, and that terrified him even more. He felt a searing heat invade his chest, as if his life energy were being drained. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. The pressure on his body was becoming unbearable, and with each breath, the sense of despair grew stronger. It was as if the shadows had the power to manipulate his mind, to make him feel the weight of each of his deepest fears. Suddenly, the woman stepped forward, her hands raised. The environment around Jacob seemed to distort even more. The air became thick, almost tangible. He felt a wave of dread invade his mind, a sense that something immense was about to happen. Whatever it was, he knew he had no control over it. He was just a piece in a game he didn't understand. "You're here now and you can't escape anymore," the woman said, a cruel smile forming on her lips. "You will become one of us." Her smile was terrifying, as if she knew exactly what would happen to him. Those words cut Jacob like a sharp knife, and he felt the ground beneath his feet begin to open up. The figures started closing in faster, and he realized the room was collapsing around him. But before he could react, an invisible force yanked him into the center of the room. He was dragged, falling to his knees on the cold, damp ground, his mind shattered. Everything around him seemed to crumble, and he felt the presence of the shadows invading him. He had no more strength to fight. The feeling of helplessness consumed him, as if he were being absorbed by a force far greater than himself, a force that knew him better than he knew himself. The sound of the voices grew louder, becoming a deafening scream, and Jacob felt his very essence being ripped from his body. He knew he was being consumed, that his soul was being torn apart by the shadows surrounding him. The cold and pain were intense, and he didn't know how much longer he would endure. He felt like he was being pulled to a place far beyond this world, where nothing else existed, just the absolute void. He tried to scream, to fight, but his words were stuck in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The woman looked at him with an empty gaze, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling. She was part of all of this, a manifestation of the place, an entity that should never have been awakened. Jacob felt his eyes slowly closing. He no longer knew what was real and what was just an illusion created by these shadows. But one thing he knew for sure: he was being consumed by something that should never have existed, something far older and more terrifying than any human could comprehend. And then, before he could react, everything went completely dark. The vortex swallowed him, and he no longer knew where he was. He didn't know if he was still alive, if he was still somewhere. He had been consumed by the void, by the creeping darkness, taking with it all his fears and despair. But in the depths of the darkness, one final phrase echoed in his mind, a soft and relentless voice telling him, "Now you are part of us." And with that, Jacob vanished, lost in the abyss. Jacob didn't know how long he had been there, trapped in an absolute void, but at some point, he realized that time no longer had any meaning. His mind was foggy, as though submerged in a dense mist, unable to distinguish past, present, or future. He didn't know if he was still alive, if he had died, or if he had simply been erased. All he felt was an intense coldness, as if his soul were being torn apart and rebuilt over and over in an endless cycle. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, breathe, as if it were a living being, and in that oppressive silence, something, or rather someone, began to approach. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. The shadows began to move around him, silently slithering like serpents. They crawled along the invisible walls of the void in which he was trapped, once again surrounding him. He could hear the whisper of their voices, low and broken, but still unsettlingly clear, as though they were inside his head. "You cannot escape." The words seemed to come from all directions at once. There was no direction, no body, only the voices intertwining, echoing in his mind. Jacob wanted to scream, wanted to distance himself from these presences, but his body didn't respond. He was trapped, shackled to something much bigger than any human could comprehend. The feeling of helplessness suffocated him, drained him from within, as if he were being consumed by an entity that had been awakened to swallow him whole. And then a light appeared, small and faint, on the horizon of this infinite darkness. A light that seemed to move, dance, as if it had a life of its own. Jacob followed it with his eyes, desperate, as if it were the only thing separating him from total madness. He tried to move toward it, but the void held him with invisible hands, pulling him back, preventing him from reaching that light. "You still think you can leave?" the woman said again, her voice now closer, more powerful. She was somewhere ahead, but Jacob couldn't see her, couldn't feel her presence clearly. All he felt was her voice, her words, as if they were infiltrating his mind. The light ahead seemed to distort, changing shape, and Jacob felt a wave of terror so intense that it almost made him lose consciousness. Something was wrong, very wrong. The light was becoming darker, as if being swallowed by an unknown force. He didn't know whether to approach or pull away, but something inside him screamed for him to do the opposite of what he was trying to do. But he was trapped, with no choices, as if the invisible walls of the void were imprisoning him. Suddenly, the voices became clearer. He recognized them. They were the same voices that had followed him here. Those dark figures he had seen in the room earlier, the ones around the altar, were now in his mind. They were inside him, invading his most intimate thoughts, breaking the barriers of his sanity. Their words were like sharp blades, cutting through his psyche. "You should never have come," said the woman's voice, now cold, empty of any compassion. Jacob tried to resist, tried to scream, but no words came from his mouth. He didn't know what to do, where to go. He was completely lost. The void, the shadows, the voices, everything was crushing his mind, leaving him with no strength to react. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, and Jacob felt his mind wandering, searching for something, anything. But there was nothing left. The void enveloped him entirely, and he didn't know whether he had become part of it, or if the void had consumed him, until nothing of his existence remained. The sensation of being sucked in, of dissolving into the darkness, took over him completely. He could no longer distinguish whether he was standing or lying down. He didn't even know if his breath still existed, or if he was simply being remembered by the darkness. And then, a sigh, faint but perceptible. It was a familiar voice, the same one he had heard before all of this started. The woman with the empty eyes was once again by his side, but this time, her presence wasn't as terrifying. There was something different about her, something he couldn't understand. "You're already lost," she said softly, almost as if she were comforting him. "You always have been." Jacob didn't respond. He no longer had the strength for anything. He was weighed down by an unbearable weight, his body and soul becoming an extension of that endless darkness. "But you can join us," the woman continued. "You can be one of us. Now." The void began to consume everything around him, every thought, every emotion, until nothing of Jacob remained. He was no longer a person, nor even a lost soul. He was part of that darkness, part of those voices, part of the abyss that now consumed him. And as if everything were inevitable, the woman with the empty eyes vanished. The darkness closed in, and Jacob no longer existed. All that remained was the echo of his presence, an invisible mark that was erased from the world, as if he had never existed. And as the darkness spread, it knew that others would come, like Jacob, and that the house, the void, the abyss, would never stop waiting.